Today is Monday, November 25th, 2024, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Yesterday, I received an interesting email from a friend of the Academy who mentioned that he was discussing the Catholic faith, I think it was with his father, and the accusation came up in the discussion that Roman Catholicism is a false religion because when the Romans converted to Christianity, we can assume that this means under Constantine, all that happened was that the Roman religion was Christianized, and that was where Roman Catholicism came from. So Roman Catholicism is just a cleaned up, rebranded form of ancient pagan religion. It's interesting to hear this argument raised against the Catholic faith because this was one of the first arguments that I ever heard from a professor when I was in college. It was the accusation that actually motivated me to leave off my studies as a pre-medical student and devote myself to classics and ancient history. What happened was I was taking, as part of my general studies requirements as a pre-med student, I was taking a Western civilization course with a professor, Jack Cargill, at Rutgers University. Professor I enjoyed, but he was an atheist. He was an apostate Southern Baptist who became an atheist, and he took every chance he had to make jabs at Christianity. And at Rutgers, I was a leading Christian student, and he knew that, and so I took those jabs personally. And I would respond, even in class at times. I would at least try to provide some sort of defense. But one day, Dr. Cargill argued that Christianity is just recycled mythology. And when he said that, I realized that I really didn't have anything to say because I was completely ignorant of mythology. And I thought to myself, that's actually a good argument if it can be true, but none of us stupid modern Christians even know what he's talking about. None of us study classics or ancient history. None of us know mythology, and I mean really know it. I don't just mean having a Google education on the subject. I mean actually studying these things and getting to the real root of them. And I acknowledge that I couldn't respond to that criticism of Christianity because I was ignorant of mythology. And so my first course as an interested classics student, I was still a pre-med student at the time, but my first course where I started to dig in was in fact a classical mythology course, which I took with Dr. Thomas Figuera at Rutgers, another one of my favorite professors. And that's how my interest in classical studies really began. It began with a challenge from an atheist professor that led me to study classical mythology, and after that I was convinced that that was what I needed to study in order to really achieve my goals in life, which were much more concerned with understanding and articulating the Christian faith than making a living as a physician. So I devoted myself to classics. So this question of the Romanization of Christianity or the Christianization of pagan religion is one that's always been very interesting to me. And I think it's very important because if it's true that there was some sort of apostolic Christianity in the first few centuries, and that this apostolic Christianity was corrupted, by some kind of blending of the apostolic Christian religion with Roman mythology, Roman religion, pagan religion, that would indeed be a corruption of the apostolic Christian faith. So it's not something that we should dismiss, but it's something that we should think about very carefully. Because if it were true, I think the argument would be justified to say that Roman Catholicism is a false religion, and that we would need to restore the Christianity of the apostles, the Christianity which Christ himself established in the world. So it's a very important objection or argument raised against Christianity, but the real issue is whether or not it's reasonable, whether or not it's true, and whether or not it leads to the conclusion that those who make it would suggest, namely that Catholicism or Roman Catholicism is a false religion. So I'd like to take some time and share my response to that objection, which, like I said, I've been stewing on now for almost 30 years. So the fundamental argument, as I just mentioned, is that there was something that existed, some sort of primitive apostolic Christianity, and that when the Romans converted to Christianity, let's say around 300 AD, around the time of Constantine's conversion. Constantine, if you don't know, was the emperor of Rome who converted to Christianity, and Christianity was transformed from a persecuted religion to a religion that was mainstream in the Roman Empire. So obviously there's a great transition that took place. We can't deny that. But the question is whether that transition, that transformation, actually changed the religion, or whether it simply fulfilled what was Christ's intention for his church. Obviously, Christ knew that the religion that he was establishing when he was on the earth was going to be an international religion. It was going to become a one-world religion. He knew that. He said that. He said to the apostles, "Go into the world and make disciples." He told them to go to the ends of the earth. So it was clearly understood from the very beginning. While the means probably couldn't be imagined by the apostles, there was no confusion that the end, the expected or anticipated end of the Christian religion, was to bring the worship of God to the ends of the earth. So Christianity was not intended to be some Middle Eastern Jewish religion, as Judaism was. It was intended to be an international religion, and Rome was the capital city of the world. So it would make sense that if this religion was going to become global, it would have to reach the capital. It would have to reach the eternal city. It would have to in some way become Romanized, that it might be internationalized. So we would expect, thinking about the Great Commission to go into the world and make disciples, to take the gospel, to preach the gospel to the ends of the earth, that it would have to go through Rome. And we can't allow ourselves to think of Rome as we think of it today, as one of the great historic cities of the world. It was the city. I don't even know if there is a city that's comparable to Rome in the modern world. We might think of New York City, even though that's not a political center. We might think of Washington, D.C., but they just don't compare. Rome was the capital of the empire. We're not talking about national states. We're not talking about democracies. We're talking about a global empire. And Rome was the capital city, the mother city of that empire. So if the religion was going to be global, it would have to at some point go through Rome. And around 300 AD, it did. And it led to the conversion of the Roman Empire in not necessarily in a personal or individual way, but in a federal sense. Christianity was changed from a religion that was persecuted and allowed to be persecuted by the Roman government to a religion that was protected and even honored by the Roman government. Now, when that Christian religion, which we can understand to have been primitive, came into that Roman culture, it entered into a culture where another religion had already existed. And that religion was the ancient mythological religion of the Greeks and Romans. Now, in modern circles, ancient religion is, I would argue, unjustly criticized. It's criticized as if men were raised as Christians and educated in Christian schools and then chose to practice pagan religion instead. It's rarely evaluated by people who consider the religious teachings and practices in their historical context. Jesus teaches us, and remember, he's the judge of the world. Jesus teaches us that to whom much is given, much is expected, and to whom less is given, less is expected. The Jewish people were given the Old Testament law. God revealed his nature and his will to the Jewish people in an exclusive way, in a peculiar way. The Jews talk about this all through the scriptures. What other nation is there that has God so near to it as the Lord our God is to us, the Jews say in the Old Testament law. It's said in the Old Testament that God revealed his will to the Jewish people and to no one else. Isaiah, I think it was, the prophet said, the nations are as a drop in the bucket to the Lord. In other words, God's love in the ancient world was for Israel. He was gracious to Israel for the sake of their fathers, and he revealed the truth to Israel. And the truth largely stayed in Israel because it was a Jewish religion. Entrance into the religion required circumcision. The ceremonies of the religion could only be performed at the temple in Jerusalem. It was an exclusively Jewish religion. In order to worship God, according to the Old Testament, a man needed to become a Jew, effectively. It was an isolated, local religion, really identified with a particular race, even though it wasn't limited to that race. But when Christ came into the world, he brought in the new covenant and made it very clear that he came not to destroy that old Jewish religion, but to bring it to its fulfillment. He says that explicitly in the Sermon on the Mount. In other words, the Jewish religion was incomplete. It was preparatory. In fact, I believe it was St. Paul who said that the law of Moses was a tutor that would lead us to Christ. A good image of the Old Testament is John the Baptist. He comes not as the Messiah, but he comes as one who bears witness to the Messiah, and then when the Messiah arrives, he says, I must decrease and he must increase. John the Baptist gives us an illustration of the Old Covenant. And then Christ comes into the world, the Messiah, the Master, the Savior, the Son of God, the Redeemer. And when Christ comes into the world, he comes to establish, he doesn't come to reform the Jewish priesthood. He comes to bring it to its end. He himself is the high priest, capital H, capital P, and the true altar is not in Jerusalem, but in heaven itself. And he comes to offer himself as the Savior of the world, and to enter into heaven, into the presence of the Father as the Redeemer, as God and man, miraculously and mysteriously united in one person, to serve as our high priest and Savior for all eternity. And this eternal priesthood is not a priesthood that's restricted in its geography to Jerusalem, but it is a heavenly priesthood that extends to the ends of the earth. And this is Christianity, the fulfillment, the completion of what was started in the Jewish religion. But these pagan nations, who are referred to as the Gentiles in Scripture, they had no benefit of revelation through their history. And they were left largely to philosophy on the one hand and poetry on the other. They were left to philosophy and poetry. When we think of poetry, we should think of men like Homer and Hesiod. They were poets, but they were also called theologians. In the history of philosophy, they were called theologians, and the reason why they were called theologians was because in their efforts to explain the causes of things in the world, their effort to explain the origin of things, the reason for things, the end of things, and so on, they used ideas of gods and goddesses, of spirits, to explain the causes. And because they explained the causes by means of gods and goddesses, in the history of philosophy they're referred to as the theologians, the ones who basically say, this is the way it is because the gods did this or did that or said this or said that. And so mythology is really the work of the ancient poets who gave spiritual explanations for everything that exists, for why things are the way they are. And stories that seek to explain the origins of things are called etiologies in history and philosophy. And that was the work of the ancient poets. It's why the poets, if you read Plato and Aristotle, they're sometimes referred to as theologians. That's what that means. Whereas when we come to the real, proper philosophers, we have a much more developed explanation of causes, which leads us to the metaphysics of Aristotle. So we've got philosophers and we've got poets in ancient history working honorably, and this is where I disagree with modern Christians. These ancient philosophers and poets were working honorably to try and explain the causes of things, to try and discover the causes of things. Why are things the way they are? Why do things work the way they do? How can we explain the origin of the world, the origin of human life, the end of human life? Why good things happen to bad people and bad things happen to good people? Why some nations seem to be blessed and other nations seem to be perpetually cursed and miserable? The effort to discover the causes of these things, and much more specific things, like the causes of sickness and death and so on, these were the interests of the poets and the philosophers, and these are noble interests. These are virtuous interests. And when we read Homer's Iliad or Odyssey or Hesiod's works and days, when we read the writings of the ancient poets like Ovid's Metamorphoses, Virgil's Aeneid, and so on, we should never judge them. We should never judge them by comparing them with Christianity. We should judge them as human efforts to give the best possible explanation for things as they can be understood by men who are very diligently searching for answers. Now, Aristotle explained that there were three different classes of men. There were beast-like pleasure seekers. There were more elegant honor seekers. And then there were wise men who sought wisdom. And so when we talk about the poets and the philosophers, we have to realize that they belong to the highest class of men, according to Aristotle, those who sought the truth through philosophical or, in more ancient times, poetical investigations. A quick side note, we can even see a parallel in church history between this, where the patristics were more like the ancient poets and the scholastics more like the philosophers. But that's another topic. But anyway, when we look at these poets and philosophers, we're not looking at corrupt perverts who are trying to lead people away from Christianity. We shouldn't compare them. If I want to think of a good comparison, we shouldn't think of the ancient poets and philosophers like the Jews who made the golden calf during the Exodus from Egypt. If we look at the story of the golden calf, we see that the Jews were just crazy people. They were immoral, they were evil, they were ungrateful. They were led out of Egypt by the miraculous power of God through the instrumentality of Moses and Aaron. It was very clear what the cause of their deliverance was. Moses made it very clear to them what the end of the Exodus would be, that they would enjoy the land that was promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob hundreds of years earlier. The true religion was developing. The true religion was in the process of being manifested by God himself, revealing his law and his system of true worship through Moses. And these crazy Jews, in the middle of the Exodus, while Moses was actually on the mountain with God, if you have the faith to accept these things, while Moses was on the mountain receiving the law from God, in their presence, after they had seen Pharaoh's armies swallowed up by the Red Sea, which they had walked across on dry land, in spite of all of that grace, all of that revelation, they turned around, made a calf out of the gold from the jewelry that they had plundered from Egypt. And they turned around and said, "Behold, this is the God who brought you out of Egypt." When we look at that, there we see the crazy, irrational, immoral idolatry that's inexcusable and justifiably condemned as evil. But we shouldn't compare Gentile religions, Gentile mythology, Gentile philosophy with the making of the golden calf, because it wasn't of the same nature. The pagan religions were efforts to understand what they experienced, to understand what they can see, what they've heard of, what they've learned of, what happens in history, what happens in the earth. It was an effort for pagans to understand. They were seeking the truth. St. Paul says they groped after the truth as blind men in the dark, trying to find their way through a world that to human senses doesn't make sense. The Jews had no such blindness, but they had these things revealed to them clearly from the beginning. From the very beginning of the law of Moses, we have the revelation of the origin of the world, how God created heaven and earth and everything it contains, how the human condition came to be what it is today. We learn in the book of Job, one of the oldest books of the Old Testament, we learn of the character of the devil and how he does evil on earth to try good men. So we've got so many of these mysteries of human experience explained for us in the earliest books of the Bible. And we really don't know to what extent any of the content of those books was known to pagan peoples. There are some traditions or theories that much of the ideas of Plato, even of Aristotle, were derived from Jewish writings, but that's really just a matter of tradition. Interesting, but I don't think verifiable. But the Gentiles were left to human reason alone. And that's really what distinguishes Jewish thought from Gentile thought. Gentile thought was philosophical, based on what could be known to man through human means. Jewish thought was based on divine revelation. Jewish thought was theological in the proper sense. Gentile thought was philosophical. And that's the difference. So we shouldn't allow ourselves to lump all pre-Christian religion, that's another key distinction, pre-Christian religion from anti-Christian religion. We shouldn't associate the religious teachings of the Greeks and Romans and ancient people with the worship of the golden calf by the Jews after their deliverance from Egypt. Those are two very different sets of circumstances. And so if we start from ancient Greek and Roman writings and begin reading their religious teachings and understand that these are their efforts to explain things. These are their efforts to explain what is a very mysterious human experience. We should treat their works with gratitude and respect, because they really accomplished a great deal of positive good. They accomplished a great deal of positive good. And we should look at them not for what they get wrong, but we should appreciate them for what they get right. And they got a lot right. If you've ever read Aristotle's Ethics, which I recommend you study it with us in the Academy, by the way. If you read Aristotle's Ethics, which most Christians, nearly all Christians, are completely ignorant of, and you realize that Aristotle wrote that 350 years before Christ, you can get a sense of the height to which Gentile philosophy had reached by human means alone. And that's really how we should look at classical literature, ancient literature. If you think about it like a child, if I take my son out, let's say I take him fishing, and he's got no experience fishing, never had any formal lessons in how to fish or do anything with fishing, and we go out to the lake one day, and it's the first time he's been out there, or one of the first times he's been out there, and he understands the goal. The goal is to catch fish. But he really doesn't understand that men have been doing this for hundreds and hundreds of years, and they've developed very, very clever methods, even gadgets, to make this very convenient. And I'm not talking about fishing poles, I'm talking about things like fish finders that mount on boats, all kinds of high-tech stuff that have been developed over time to help men catch fish. And I bring my son to the lake and I just tell him, we want to catch some fish. And so he says, well, what should we do, Dad? And I say, you can do whatever you want. We just have to accomplish the goal. What's the goal? The goal is to catch some fish. And so, he looks around and thinks about what he can do. And he starts getting to work, trying to figure out how he can catch some fish. And after a while, he comes out of the woods and he's got himself a little net that he managed to weave together with some sticks and some soft branches and leaves. And he's made himself a little net and he runs out into the edge of the water and starts trying to scoop up fish with this net that he's made. What would we say? Would we criticize the net and say that that net is not as good as a net that I could buy at a sporting goods store today? Or would I say, hey, that's a pretty good idea. That was smart. You made yourself a little net. That's pretty clever. You see how different it is if we focus on the positive achievement rather than on the inferiority to something that's got advantages. And with Christianity, it's got the advantage of divine revelation, so give us a break. And then imagine if after a while, the boy started to realize, I noticed that further out, further than I can reach with my net, I see there's bigger fish out there. And so he's trying to figure out, how in the world can I get to those fish that are out there? And he thinks of an idea to put a worm on a hook and tie it to a string and throw it out into the deeper water and try to catch some bigger fish with a piece of string and a hook. We'd say that's a good idea. That's a smart solution. No, that's not as good as a modern fishing pole, but that's the idea, and he's showing that he's getting it. He understands what needs to be done, and he's being pretty clever with the methods that he's inventing to try and accomplish the goal. So we can look at that event and say, you know what, you were very impressive in what you did, because the things that you thought to do are actually the things that have been proven to be most effective, which have been developed by men who have been professional fishermen for centuries. And then I could present him with a modern fishing net from a sporting goods store and a new state-of-the-art fishing pole and say, what do you think of that? This is what has been developed by these professional fishermen over the years. Why don't you go give that a try? Think about that boy, because he already understands the goal and he's already established in a primitive way the true means of pursuing that goal. He'll actually understand these tools and make good use of them. So I could draw that out further, but I want to stop there and just say that when we look at the ancient religions, we should look at them as the work of children who have been given a task, who have a mission to fulfill. And they don't have all the information, they don't have all the tools, they don't have all the resources they need. And so what they accomplish needs to be judged relative to their disadvantages. Kind of like having a contest at school where kids are given some toothpicks and glue and challenge to build a bridge. We don't compare it to the Brooklyn Bridge. We're looking to see if they're able to discern the principles that would make for strong bridge making. And that's what leads us to judge this as a good design and that as a bad design. We judge things relatively, and we should judge classical religion and philosophy relatively. But, as I said, when we think about how much Aristotle had achieved in 350 BC, we really have to marvel at the power of human philosophy. The only thing we can do is marvel at it. And when we consider that Aristotle established the sciences that he did establish 350 years before Christ, and then we look at ignorant, dopey, modern Christian culture living 2,000 years into the Christian era with all kinds of benefits and graces and resources, publications, institutions, on, and we ask, is there a Christian man in the world today who understands true morality better than Aristotle, who lived 350 years before Christ, before the revelation of the capital W Word of God? Does any Christian have a grasp of morality like Aristotle? And what we should do when we speak about the ancients is we should marvel at them. We should marvel at their achievements, philosophically, religiously, and so on. But Christians don't do that, because modern Christians are just reactionary critics. All they do is find fault with things and react negatively to things and imagine that's some kind of godliness. So let's consider the ancient Roman religion. Their religious teaching, as I said, was largely an effort to explain observable, perceptible realities with respect to their origins, or to discern the causes of things. They were much more sensitive to nature, to the forces of nature, to the not just the great forces of nature, but even minor forces of nature than we are today, because we largely act independently of nature. For example, we work whenever we want to because we have electricity. I can turn the lights on at 2 o'clock in the morning and put in 2 hours of work. I really don't care what time of day it is. My work is not related to the time of the day because I can control the environment. I can turn on the air conditioning. It doesn't matter that it's 95 degrees outside. I can turn on the lights. Doesn't matter that it's 11 p.m. We're much more independent of nature than men in the ancient world were. We're not conscious of things like the position of the sun in the sky, or the position of the sun in the zodiac, in the heavens. We're not attentive to the phase of the moon, to the direction of the wind, and so on. Whereas in the ancient world, even in more recent agricultural cultures, I could even say in America before the industrial age, back in the 1800s. And I would say that for me, living on the farm, after growing up in the suburb, living on the farm, I've become much more conscious and aware of the forces of nature than I ever was as a kid. When I first moved to North Carolina, I couldn't even understand how a well could work. When I thought of a well, I thought of a guy lowering a bucket down into a hole. I didn't think that they could have a 250-foot deep pipe drilled into the ground through layers and layers of stone that could pump up pure water out of aquifers hundreds of feet beneath. I didn't even know that world existed as a suburban kid. I knew nothing of most of the animals that are out in the country. I never saw a hawk or an eagle when I was a kid. Never saw deer or raccoons or possums up close. Really never understood anything about nature until I got out into the country. Then started to learn about the cycle of the seasons and the gardens and the farm planting and the different harvesting seasons. All of this was new to me, and I became much more conscious of it. But for most Americans, if you think about the voting population, I would say that most people living in blue areas of the country know very little about the natural world. Whereas those who I would say live in the red areas, again, not that they're wise in these things, but they're at least more conscious of them. The ancient people who lived in agricultural society, were much more conscious of all of the forces of nature. And again, not just major forces, but also subtle things like the functions of different plants, the functions of different insects and animals, when things appear, when things disappear, when things are ripe, when things are dying, and so on. And so these ancient philosophers and poets sought to explain all of these things, and they were much more sensitive to nature than we are, which is one of the reasons why mythology is difficult for us to appreciate. When we hear, for example, that in the ancient religion, the winds were spoken of as persons. There was the east wind and the north wind and the south wind and the west wind. And these different winds had personalities based on their characteristics. The southern wind was warm, often brought prosperity and comfort and good weather. The north wind was normally associated with storms and freezing temperatures that kill crops and kill animals and make life very difficult. And these winds, by the poets, were ascribed personalities. They were given human-like characters. This is called anthropomorphism. We could also call it personification. And so the people began to think about these natural forces not as just forces of nature, which really doesn't make any sense if you try to live with that mentality. It still doesn't explain the origins or the causes or the ends of these things. You just have this sort of random chaos of activity. They started to pay attention to the patterns and the habits, to the character of these different forces, and personify them. And when they personified them, it was as if they became familiar. It was as if they became understandable, that the order of the natural world was discerned by man, and the world didn't seem like such a chaotic place anymore. But you could walk outside one morning and say, uh-oh, Boreas is here. I can feel him coming. And you know what that means? It means that we're going to see this, and it's probably going to do this, and we probably need to do this today. We need to make sure we get outside and do this. You can see that thinking of nature in that way gave the people order and allowed them to gain mastery of the natural world and not feel like they're living in just some wild, unpredictable chaos. And that word is key, predictable. What determined whether an idea was effective or not, was good or not, was wise or not, was that it could be tested as a means of making predictions that helped to improve the quality of life. That was really the goal of this mythology. The goal of the religion was to try to predict, or if possible, control future outcomes, so that man was not just a slave of destiny or chance, but actually had some reason to hope that he could influence the future for good, so that he could actually be happy. And you can see happiness now tied to this ability to predict, anticipate, and control one's life. So this is what the intention was in the development of ancient religion. And we can get into areas where we criticize. We say, well, what about areas where they were sexually immoral? Well, they're not Christians. We have sexually immoral Christians alive in 2024 AD. So before you criticize anything that we would consider immoral as Christians, we've got to consider the context. The idea that man and woman should marry and man should have one wife and be committed to her until death, that's a Christian idea. That's a Christian idea. You could say, well, Jesus said Jesus is talking about divine revelation. That's a theological idea that belongs to the Judeo-Christian divine revelation. Gentiles are not accountable to that. And so when we judge Gentile institutions, Gentile culture, different ideas that Gentiles had about things like marriage or sexuality, we have to consider the context. We've got to consider the context. And besides, Christians are going to have a very difficult time arguing that their sexual practices, or the sexual practices of Judeo-Christian tradition, prove that they have the true religion. You're going to have to explain how Solomon ended up with hundreds of wives. You're going to have to explain how the priests of the Christian church are agreeing on billion-dollar settlements with sex abuse victims. So picking on sexual morality is not going to win the day for Christianity. We're going to have to be more subtle and honest than that to get to the real issues. But as I explained, the personification of natural forces develops this idea of gods and goddesses, or spirits, which are really just persons who have certain characteristics, certain habits that are observed in the natural world. And when you look at mythology with that mentality, you can see that it's an attempt to make order of the world. And that's the duty of a wise man. It is the duty of a wise man, St. Thomas says, to order things. It's the duty of a wise man to order things. And what those ancient poets and philosophers were trying to do in the midst of a chaos of natural forces and events that seemed completely random and unpredictable was to try and make some order in the world so they could actually live and so that culture could develop over time. When you take that understanding into ancient mythology and judge it reasonably and fairly and look for the positive, you can see that much of what the ancient religion established was in fact true. There's a great deal of truth all through ancient religion. They did not have the light of divine revelation, but were left entirely to their own observations, to their own investigations, their own reasonings, and so on. And the test, as I said, was predictability, the ability to predict future things for the sake of happiness. And this had many different levels of development. First, men had to figure out how to just survive physically. And so gaining an understanding of the weather and agriculture and animals, things like that, which we see spoken of even in the Old Testament, that was a first obstacle, just to establish physical safety, to allow for men to provide for themselves sufficiently by the control, by the mastery and ordering of the natural world. After that, life could get more subtle. Thoughts about happiness could get more subtle. And so we see a focus on moral philosophy as we get into classical Greek philosophy. We see men like Socrates, who really are moral philosophers. The focus of almost all of their attention is on morality. We look at Aristotle in the Ethics, talking about the pursuit of happiness and how it relates to morality, to virtue. We see these are much more subtle, developed views of human life that take for granted that there's shelter and food and clothing. And we see this development of culture over time. This is what really led to the classical Greek civilization. Think about the context. You have this established Greek society in a place where there's good weather on the Mediterranean Sea. They face external threats from other nations, namely the Persian Empire in the east. And then around, 500 BC, I believe, you have the Persian invasion of the west. And then we've got the famous Greek victory over the Persians and the chasing back of that great power all the way back into the east. And then you've got this time of Greek peace and prosperity. And in the context of that peace and prosperity, we have this flowering of classical Greek culture, which continues all the way through Hellenistic times until the end of the life of Aristotle and Alexander the Great. And that culture, that developed Greek culture, which was allowed to develop because of the peace and prosperity that followed the Persian Wars, that was then carried by Alexander all through the world. And all of human culture was enriched by that Hellenization. But we see how there's levels of development. First, it's just matters of survival, of gaining control of the forces of nature so that men could establish villages and towns and live comfortably and healthily. Then you've got political issues that develop, and we see those really in the 7th through 6th centuries in Greece becoming really clear. Then we've got this flowering of Greek culture in the 4th into the 3rd century before Christ. And then it's as if the fullness of time had come, when things had been brought to a level of development and cultivation where the world was disposed to the revelation of the truth, capital T, truth, in the incarnation of the Son of God himself. And so we see that the place was fit for the coming of Christ, and then Christ comes as the light of the world and sends his disciples out as the light of the world into a Gentile world that had already climbed to a certain level of culture and understanding. Not perfect, but very good relative to what could have been. And when we hear stories about, the ancient people were just a bunch of filthy, immoral, homosexuals, pedophiles, pagans, terrible, filthy, that's totally false. The people who say that are usually liberal scholars who are trying to justify their own pedophilia and homosexuality and immoral lives, divorces, and all this mess. They try to pretend like this is how the world was. And it's false. You want to know what human morality looked like in the 4th century BC? Go read Aristotle's Ethics. That's what good men were studying and practicing in their lives. Go read Xenophon's book on home economics and see what family life was understood to be by the ancient Greeks. It's just simply not true. And that's one of the reasons why modern classics departments have died, is because once these liberal professors start pushing this worthless, immoral, perverted interest in the past, again, which is not even true, it would be like looking at American society and choosing not to look at the Thomistic Institute, but choosing to go on some pornography website and say, this is American culture. It's not true. That's the worst of American culture. And only perverts look at it in the first place. The best of American culture is found elsewhere. The same thing was true in the ancient world. So good men would go and look for the best sources, and they would find them in the writings of the philosophers and some of the poets and so on. And so when we see the apostolic age, we see the apostles going out on their evangelistic missions in the book of Acts, we see them coming into the presence, coming into contact with Stoics and Epicureans. We see this in Acts chapter 17. Coming into contact with men who really stand at the peak of human achievement in culture and learning. And we see them interact with these Stoics and Epicureans. And we see the Stoics and Epicureans converting to Christianity. Because Christianity, even for Gentile philosophy, just as it's the perfection of Jewish religion, Christianity is also the perfection of human philosophy. Now, when Christianity gets to Rome, gets into this Gentile culture, there's already a lot of truth there. There's already a lot of truth there. The Christians are not walking into Sodom and Gomorrah. They're walking into places that are already well governed, well ordered, with established laws, with courts, with political bodies that make laws and enforce laws. The apostles are entering into places that are already cultured, that are already intelligent, that are already filled with all kinds of wisdom and achievements in arts and sciences. And they're coming with the perfection of all of that development, the perfection of wisdom in Christ and in the church. And so when we look at the conversion of Constantine, some will criticize it and say, well, Constantine was just worldly-minded political man. He was just looking at the organization of the church, the ordering of the clergy, the ordering of the hierarchy of the church. He looked at the way that the bishops of the Catholic Church organized the administration of the church, and he just wanted to bring those Christian principles and ideas into the service of his own government. And this was just some kind of worldly-minded, temporally ambitious plot to benefit from becoming an ally with the Christian bishops. Well, no duh, because the Christian bishops were the wisest men in the world. No duh. So the fact that Constantine chose to do that shows us one thing. Constantine was smart. Constantine actually got it. He said, we've been developing these institutions and these laws and policies for centuries and centuries, and the Christian church is operating on better principles. They have better order. They have more control of their people and institutions and teachings and laws and all these things. It's a more wisely ordered and administered society. I wish that we could get these men involved in the administration of the empire. And so we see this bringing in of the bishops from this sort of spiritual administration into an administration that now is mixed with temporal powers and responsibilities. That's what Christianity was supposed to be. It's the light of the world, going out and enlightening all the nations. And Constantine recognized that. Constantine said, I want these principles to work for my government. Just as the blind man said, I want this power of Christ to work for me, to allow me to see, to give me my sight, to give me my health, and so on. No duh. So we have this mixing of pagan and Christian culture. But what it really is not a Romanization of Christian culture, because the Roman culture was there first. What we have in the history of the church is not the Romanization of Christian culture, as if Christianity was established and then the Romans came in and changed it. What we actually have is the Christianization of Roman culture. And that's the whole purpose of the gospel, is to bring to perfection human life and culture and learning, to bring to perfection human efforts to understand God and to worship Him appropriately, to refine them, to sanctify them, to perfect them, and so on. And that, of course, is a process. It doesn't happen in a moment. We just don't switch from black to white in one moment. It's a process. And the men who are there actually working, unlike the idle modern Christian critics who sit in their living room and talk about what should be done and do nothing, people who actually do this work understand the benefit of compromise, that we're willing to move forward 1 inch at a time, 1 step at a time, 1 piece at a time, so long as we continue moving in the right direction. And this is what happened in ancient Rome. So if there already is an established system of religion with moral teaching and practices, and a Christian comes into this culture and says, what should we do here? We've got this religious system. It's been established for centuries and centuries. It's tied into all kinds of secular events and festivals, and it's also tied into the natural year and the cycles of the seasons and all of the different human activities that are connected with natural events. This whole system of life that's already established, much of it is very good. But there are some errors in it, there are some things in it that are not true, that we can make better. What should we do? Should we blow up the whole system? Should we destroy all of the good that's here in the name of trying to make something better? Or should we just focus on fixing the things that are repugnant to God's word? Fixing the things that can't be allowed, that are impossible. And that's what the Christians did. They didn't bother changing good things. For example, if there's a planting festival and the people at the time of the year when it's time to plant their fields have some sort of tradition where they pray for blessings upon their planting, upon the seed, upon the soil, and all these things, and they've got all of these established traditions and festivals, they're still going to need to do all those things even if they become Christians. They've already got all of this culture established in their society. And if we're going to object to anything in it, we're going to object to the very tip of the iceberg where we find some religious teaching that's imperfect, that needs to be brought into obedience to Christianity. What a modern Christian would do is nuke the whole thing and just leave a ghetto with no culture, no order, no religion, and say, there, at least we're not saying that one bad prayer anymore. But the actual evangelists who led these people to conversion were thankfully wiser than that. And what they did was just gently and patiently and slowly teach the people, evangelize the people, model the good Christian life for people, and lead them to see, not that they needed to abandon what they were doing because it was positively evil. Because again, in historical context, it wasn't positively evil. But see that something better was possible. See that something better was possible. To see that rather than this pagan sacrifice that took place to try and appease the god of the the god of the fields or the god of the wheat. Rather than do that, to actually offer a prayer to the God who created heaven and earth, the one true and eternal God, the cause of all causes, that beyond which nothing greater could be imagined. What Christianity offered the pagans was not a completely different universe to live in, but a better way, more accurate teachings, better principles, better religion, better sacrifices. And the change that was needed was not a complete throwing out of the baby with the bathwater, but a simple change of some of the elements that were not informed by divine revelation and which needed to be enlightened by that revelation. So it's no surprise to find all kinds of mixed ideas. But the question that we're to answer is really, are they evil? Are they actually evil? Now, to people who think like Puritans, they would say, yes, they're evil. The whole thing needs to be destroyed. And all that those people do, who have that puritanical view of religion, all they do is destroy culture and leave behind ghettos. They create ghettos out of what were once beautiful societies. Societies that were well-ordered and happy, that simply needed to be perfected and improved by Christian religion. They turn them into atheist scumholes, literally. That's what Puritanism does. You look where Protestantism has grown and gained control, and today you will find atheist countries with no culture. Everything gets destroyed. Nothing is set up in its place. It's just a reactionary, critical, negative, counterfeit Christianity. And Catholicism doesn't work like that. So the fact that we can find these elements of Christian life that seem to be intertwined with previously established cultural, philosophical, agricultural, even mythological traditions, they're most of the things that we consider to be beautiful and joyful in modern society, because they were beautiful and joyful to begin with. And our concern should be to make them more perfect, not to destroy them. What many Christians do is effectively destroy them, and they're left with nothing. They're left with no culture. How are the Christian schools doing? How are the Christian universities doing? How are seminaries doing? How are religious communities doing now that we've banished all of this Romanized Christianity? They can't even figure out how to stay alive because they've become these empty shells of what real Christianity ought to be. And the degree to which we can, if it's even possible, restore that culture will determine whether there's any chance of saving these institutions from just total destruction. And so we have the choice to follow these miserable, reactionary, critical, modern Christians who build nothing, or to follow the established example and habits of men who actually led Gentiles to conversion. So I think the answer to the problem is pretty simple. But anyway, I hope that's a helpful response to the question. We're over an hour, so I want to wrap this up. But I think we've covered some important principles on this issue. And what I think might be helpful in the future is to take some of those principles and now start to flesh them out. But anyway, before I finish, what do you think I'm doing in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy? This is exactly what we're working to do. The mission of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy is to research, that is to learn, not assume we know everything, but to research, restore, not invent, not imagine that we're the first people to ever do anything intelligent, but realize that everything that we need to do has already been done in the past, and much of the work is simply work of restoration, to research, restore, to publish, to actually make it accessible in modern society, and then to teach the classical liberal arts. So that is the pre-Christian philosophical curriculum, which was the bed into which Christianity was set, and which I would argue it needs to remain. As we establish and restore the teaching of the classical liberal arts and classical philosophy, I believe that we'll also find a renewed and attractive form of Christianity that actually makes sense and interests people, and that offers an entire culture with it that makes life beautiful and happy. So that's what we're actually doing in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. And the Classical Liberal Arts Academy is my response, my ultimate response to what was the original challenge that I faced as a college student, which was to show that Christianity is not merely a recycling of ancient mythology, but is actually the perfection of everything that ancient men achieved by means of poetry and reasoning. I hope that's helpful. God bless.